Hi everyone, what's happening today? In this video, we're going to show you how to build a rock wall, like a cliff face, for your model railroad layout. There's a lot of places on a railroad layout where you can use a cliff face or a rock wall. And in this video, in a few easy steps, we're going to go through how to do that. I'm going to be continuing with working on the Polar Express traditional low gauge layout this morning. And part of what I'm doing is working on the backdrop. The backdrop is that strip of plywood that you see behind the tunnel, and I'm going to turn that into a rock cliff that will then fade away into the distance with mountains once I get a piece of artwork finished that will go above that backdrop that you see now, raising the height of it and blending in with the rest of the scenery on the layout. So part of that then is casting plaster rocks to build the cliff with. As I cast those rocks, I'm using molds from Woodland Scenics. I've got 3 different molds that are for quite large rocks. One is called base rock, one is called faceted rock, and the other is called a rock wall. These 3 molds together will give me a variety of plaster rocks that I can then color and use on the layout to make that cliff that will fade away into the artwork that goes above it. So I've used these a few days ago to cast the first of those rocks, and the first of those rocks are cured, ready to go. I released them from the molds yesterday, and I have the molds now getting ready for the next stage. Part of that means I have to clean the molds. There's always some bits of plaster that remain in the cracks and crevices that need to be cleaned out so that the molds are thoroughly clean before you use them each time. That's what I'm going to be doing next, is cleaning those molds and then moving on from there. To clean the molds, I start by soaking them in warm water. That soak in warm water releases a lot of the plaster bits that remain in the mold. Once they've been soaked in water for a while, the next thing is to kind of work through them and pull out as much of this as you can. And yeah, you're going to get your hands a little bit wet and dirty, but that's just part of the process. I'll do this to each of the 3 molds, cleaning out and picking out all of that debris. After you let your molds soak in warm water for 10 or 15 minutes, they'll come out perfectly clean. You may have a couple of persistent little bits of plaster that you need to take a toothpick and wiggle out to get them to free up, but most of the stuff will just rinse away after 10 or 15 minutes of soaking in warm water. We mix the lightweight hydrocal plaster according to the directions on the box. We take one part of it a step further. It says use cold water, start with cold water, and we go further. We start with ice water actually. It seems to give us a little bit more time to work, and it also seems to result in the mix being a bit smoother. Once we've done that, we pour it into the molds. Careful to try to fill up the molds. These molds, as you can see here, are in holders that we've made out of insulation board that makes them level. They're not really level otherwise, and it's important to get them as level as possible. This one pour will not be enough to fill all the molds. We'll need to do probably 2 more batches of the hydrocal in order to fill the 3 molds that we want to fill for making the large rocks. This one, first mix here, though, just as an illustration, is exactly according to the directions on the hydrocal box. That is 2 parts cold water to 5 parts hydrocal. And we'll mix up 2 more batches. That should fill the rest of the molds, and then we'll be ready to start attaching the plaster rocks to the backboard, the backdrop of the layout, as soon as they have set up, which takes about 40 minutes to an hour at a minimum. I'm using a low-cost Plaster of Paris mixture as my adhesive to put these stones against the wall. Now I'm going to mist the wall, the backdrop wall, a little bit, wet it a little bit before I get started so that the stones will adhere better. And I'll also wet the back of the stones a little bit. I don't need to soak them, but getting them damp is going to help the plaster of Paris to stick on. Then the next step is just simply to take the plaster of Paris and spread it over the back of the rock that you want to put in place. This is not scientific or anything, it's just getting it on there, and it'll be tacky, sticky for long enough for this rock to adhere to the place I want to put it. Putting the first rock in place right there, and I'm going to need to hold that for a little bit to get it to stick. It's not going to want to adhere just all by itself without a little bit of help. So I'm holding it a little bit to get it to stick, and then I'm also going to dribble some plaster of Paris down around the edge at the top. That will also further cause it to adhere to the rock or to the backboard. Not any scientific measures, just a little bit dribbled down the back that will fill in a gap between the plaster rock and the backdrop and help it to hold in place. That only takes a little bit. Once it's there, it's there. I'm going to use a very similar rock for the next course up, and on this one I'm going to be again spreading the plaster of Paris on the back, and getting it worked in a little bit, and then I'll put it up against the backdrop, and this will be the second course on this, and will fit in right there. And again, I'll put some plaster of Paris down the back through this little crack between the backboard and the rock. Just dribble a little bit down there, and that will help this rock to adhere. And that's really all there is to it. It doesn't take too long for it to start to set up and stick to the back. So I don't need to really be putting a great deal down here, holding it for a very long time. This is going to stick pretty quickly to the plaster cloth that is on the backboard. And as that adheres to the plaster cloth, I can move on, and I'll start with my next rock and my next rock and my next rock after that. So we'll continue with a couple more here, just to give you an idea how this goes. And it's, again, not a very difficult process. Make sure I got enough water on there so it is at least damp. And we'll spread some of this on here. And that gets spread around, and as it does, it forms the adhesive that will hold this onto the backdrop. Now you can fit these in many different ways, and it doesn't have to be, exactly precise, because once we're through with this, we can come back and we can take more plaster of Paris and create grout lines. We'll also take the smaller rocks, and once the larger rocks have adhered, we'll take smaller rocks and we'll use those to fill in between the gaps between the larger rocks. So that will eventually then create a pretty solid looking arrangement. Now, the rocks, another thing you can do is to turn the rock upside down, and you'll get a different look. So do one way, do the next one the opposite way, and that gives you a completely different look once you're done and once you go forward with applying the Woodland Scenic colors to it. The plaster of Paris has a 10 to 15 minute work time, roughly. So you've got a little bit of time to get this done before it sets up completely on you. Once it sets up completely on you, then you are done. It's all over with at that point. So we'll put this one right about there, and then I'll do the same technique of dribbling it down the back in the gap between the rock. There's a little gap between the plaster rock and the backdrop, and I'll dribble it down into that rock gap, and that will improve the adhesion. It'll make it stick more quickly and more securely. And that is all that is to that process. So here's our final outcome of creating a rock-faced cliff using cast hydrocal plaster lightweight rocks, and then using the pigments to color those rocks. I'm going to link below to the Woodland Scenics website for the tinting process with the pigments, and I'll share that with you in my comments. But this is a fairly fast, fairly simple, fairly easy way to do it. You have to have a little patience, let things dry between coats, but if you take the time and mold the rocks and then affix them, it's going to look great. One comment on fixing the rocks to the cliff face. Woodland Scenics in their video is going to suggest that you use plaster cloth attached to the back of the rock to then affix it to the plaster cloth on the cliff face. My experience is that doesn't work. What I used instead was just a little bit of Plaster of Paris. You can mix it up in small batches as you need it, and it's very cheap. You can get it at Lowe's or Home Depot or a hardware store, lots of places. Mix that Plaster of Paris up in small batches as you need it, and then put it on the back of the rock that you're going to press up against the cliff and fix it in place. Now, for some of the heavier rocks, larger rocks, you may need to hold that for a little bit in order for it to really catch hold and stay in place. For the smaller rocks, it's just a touch and go. But for the larger rocks, you may have to hold them a little bit to get them to stay attached where you want them. But once you do it, you've got a very solid surface to work with. There's a few places, cracks and crevices in here, where I will be affixing foliage, small trees, shrubbery, dead shrubbery, winter scene foliage to fill in, but that's a process that's for another video. So thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Please click the thumbs up below and like the video, and subscribe. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to my channel. You'll be notified when new videos come out. Also, please share this video with anyone you know that's into modeling that might want to do something similar. Again, I appreciate your time. Bye for now.